Thoburn's command retreated to this side of the river, and you have that really uncomfortable scene transpiring between Thoburn's and Ricketts' division. You have pickets are brought in all along this line right here. So the person who was in command of the picket line that night was Lieutenant Colonel George Montague of the 37th Massachusetts Infantry. So Montague has with him 2 companies from the 37th Massachusetts and a company of 40 men from the 2nd Rhode Island Infantry. So if you are, fans of Ken Burns' Civil War documentary, one of the voices that you hear a lot in there is Elijah Hunt Rhodes. Elijah Hunt Rhodes he was actually commanding that company of Rhode Islanders as part of the picket line here on the night of July the 18th. So the first concern for Horatio Wright that night, as well as for Colonel Montague, was what do the Confederates intend to do now that Thoburn has retreated to the eastern side of the Shenandoah River. So one of the things that the Confederates were doing that night, and there are a lot of Union soldiers writing about this, is they were building barricades along the river. So there was one soldier in Thoburn's command who was here that night, just trying to process everything that he has gone through. He wrote very simply, "We can easily see the rebels now at work. They seem to be building barricades along the riverbank." So what Jubal Early does not know is Horatio Wright going to regroup and launch another attack. From the Federal perspective, they don't know if the Confederates are going to try to come across this side of the river. But to me, once you start building barricades, that's sending the signal we're going on the defensive at this stage of the game. So that night, Colonel Montague's charge, his mission, is obviously to warn against any potential Confederate incursions to this side of the river, but his primary objective is to make certain that wounded Union soldiers from the other side of the river can get to this side of the river. Now, every single soldier, so there's about 130 guys who are on picket duty that night. Every single one of those soldiers is armed not with what Union soldiers are traditionally armed with during the Civil War. So, quiz question time for the audience. Most Union soldiers are carrying what? Infantrymen are carrying what as their weapon?
Springfield rifle.
Springfield musket, Enfield rifle musket, three-band muzzleloader. That is not what the 37th and the 2nd Rhode Island had. They had Spencer repeating rifles.
Nice.
All right? Yeah. So the 37th Massachusetts, they received their Spencer repeating rifles just 6 days before this battle. So when the 6th Corps came up from Petersburg to Washington to help with the protection of the national capital, that's when they were given their Spencer repeating rifles. They had never used them before. They were excited to use them. This is their first chance to use them. Now, the 2nd Rhode Island did not have Spencer rifles. They only had their regular traditional Springfield or Enfield muskets. So Colonel Montague wanted to make certain that every guy along this picket line had a Spencer. So Spencers were loaned to those 40 men in the 2nd Rhode Island. So every single Union soldier along this picket line here is going to have a Spencer rifle. Spencer rifle, for those of you who don't know, it is a magazine-fed firearm. It has a magazine in the buttstock. It holds 7 rounds. All right, so this gives you a clear advantage in firepower for someone who is using a muzzle-loading rifled musket against you. Now, that night, Colonel Montague told his men, do whatever you feel is necessary in order to prevent the Confederates from coming over here and giving proper cover fire to wounded who are trying to get across, or Thoburn's men who are trying to help those wounded across. And as those soldiers were helping wounded across, those are the types of stories, by the way, that were inspiring that poet Emma Thomas to write what she wrote in 1893. There were some soldiers in Montague's command who thought, if we're just down here, we can't have as good a view of things, so let's get up into the trees. So there are numerous accounts of soldiers in the 37th Mass and the 2nd Rhode Island actually scaling the trees to get a clearer view of the other side. So again, today vegetation is really high, there's a lot of trees. There were trees along the riverbank, but not to the extent that we have today. There are 2 islands in the river. We'll see one of them much more clearly in a moment. We'll see the second one a little bit later on the tour. They have trees on them today. During the time of the Battle of Cool Spring, very few trees, actually mostly that was planted in corn. A few trees on there, but mostly agricultural. So you have these guys from Massachusetts and Rhode Island getting up into the trees so that they can get a clear view to the other side. They can see what the Confederates are doing. You might think, well, how can they see? Well, guess what? It's almost a full moon on the night of July 18th. The full moon was July 19th. So it was a clear night. It was full moon. There were no clouds in the sky. So if you've ever been outside at night, at dark in a full moon, you can see stuff. You can certainly pick out shadows. And that's what these guys in the trees are doing. They're looking for any sort of movement. And if they think it is Confederate stretcher bearers or Confederate soldiers, they are shooting. So Colonel E.A. Osborne of the 4th North Carolina, he was distraught by this because they're trying to get their wounded off of the field back to field hospitals and eventually Winchester, which is where all the Confederate wounded will be taken. And he wrote simply, he said, "The fire of the pickets from the treetops annoyed our men very, very much." So one of those North Carolinians that night was looking for the muzzle flashes from the treetops. So he actually fired. Who this North Carolinian is, we don't know. We only have Osborne's account. But he fired at one of those muzzle flashes and apparently shot and killed one of the soldiers who was on this picket line here, commanded by Montague. Bad for that soldier who was killed over here, but also bad for that North Carolinian. Because if you could see their muzzle flash, we can see your muzzle flash. And so other marksmen up in the trees, they fire and they kill that man, and he is no more a problem. All throughout that night, there is picket firing being exchanged between both sides. As Confederates are trying to evacuate their wounded, as they're trying to build those barricades. And oh yes, you still have artillery firing, probably well into 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock that night from, both sides of the battlefield. So you have to think about this for a moment. If you are a wounded Union soldier on the other side, and you simply have been so debilitated by your wounds, you don't have the strength, you can't muster enough of strength to get off of that field. And again, I'm going to pose this as a question. Who is your best hope to survive? Confederate. And so there are examples of Confederates who, had it not been for them, some pretty severely wounded Union soldiers would have perished on that battlefield. And we're going to move out of here, go down closer to Island Ford and talk about one of those stories. But are there any questions before we do that?
Barricade. When you say barricades, what does that look like?
So basically, question was, what do the barricades look like? So they are taking whatever they can find, trees, fence rails, rocks, and just piling them up to build some sort of an obstacle to slow down a Union advance.
Wasn't pickets firing on each other frowned upon generally during the war, or does it depend on the battle and the situation?
I think it depends on the circumstance.
Okay.
From the perspective, generally you're right, it would just be a security force. Let's stay here because we don't want to entice, right? We don't want to bring on a much larger engagement. In this case, objective number one is we don't want them to cross. Objective number two, we've got to get as many wounded across as possible, and so we've got to shoot them.
Makes sense.
Basically. Anything else? All right, let me cut through the crowd here.